All right, thank you for that introduction. So my name is Isaac Erg. I'm part of the Information Processing and Algorithms Laboratory in the Electrical Engineering Department here at Penn State. Again, my advisor is Dr. Monga. I'm going to be presenting my PhD thesis defense today on domain-enriched machine learning for synthetic aperture sonar. So part of this talk, at the beginning, what I want to talk is just give you a little bit of intuition on how the sonar data is collected, a little bit on how it's formed, just to kind of get everybody up to speed. And again, just develop your intuition. So as we talk about the contributions that I've made, you have some kind of concrete place to put them in your mind. And I'm going to talk about 3 contributions that I've done. Contribution 1 is going to be an object recognition contribution. So I'm looking at, I have a sonar image and I'm trying to determine is some object of interest in that image. For contribution 2, this is going to be an image segmentation problem. So I'm taking a large SAS image and I'm going to be segmenting that image into different relevant oceanographic pieces. For the 3rd contribution, we're going to be looking at image quality improvement. So this is, if I get a sonar image and the quality is not sufficient, there's ways that I can improve that. And then finally, at the end, I'm just going to wrap up and kind of summarize the body of work that was done here. And then I'll open it up for questions. So just to give a feel for how the system works. So in general, these sonars, these synthetic aperture sonars will ride on some kind of unmanned underwater vehicle or UUV. You can think about this as just like a fancy underwater drone. Here's an example of one here. This drone is about 13 inches in diameter. You can see the props on the back of it. And then the sonar section here, it's got a sonar both on port and starboard sides. So I'm going to throw that guy in the water. He's going to be configured in some way to then go through and do kind of a mow the grass or serpentine pattern to capture the image. And the imaging geometry is going to look something like this. So I'm going to have on one side my sonar footprint, say for the starboard side here. As the vehicle travels in this direction, we're going to call this the along track direction. As the vehicle sees out with the sonar in range, we're going to call that the range direction. Again, both the sonar has generally, the UUV generally has sonars on both sides. But this just kind of gives you an idea of the sensing geometry. And this is for a single ping or transmit, acoustic transmit into the water. So what's the difference, or what does it mean that we have a synthetic aperture versus a real aperture? So real aperture sonar, which is often called side scan sonar, you can think of this as sort of what you see in the movie. So you're going to transmit an acoustic ping. The intensity of the reflection is going to come back, and you're going to take that particular reflection and you're going to turn it into an intensity map. So you're going to develop these raster lines as the vehicle's propagating through the water. What's a con of it is that the resolution is going to degrade as a function of range, because I'm going to have spreading loss. So as I see farther out in range, my azimuthal resolution, that cell is going to enlarge. And also, if the vehicle's traveling through currents, it's going to be sloshing around. It could be yawing, it could be pitching. What's going to happen is I may not get uniform coverage of the area that I'm trying to survey, because I'm just not acoustically and sonifying that. On the other hand, synthetic aperture sonar, instead of using just a single ping and generating a scan line for each ping, what I'm going to use is I'm going to use multiple pings to form each pixel, where I'm going to use a lot more pings out at range than I will close to the sensor. And what this gives me is this gives me resolution that's constant with range. So I'm going to have square pixels everywhere throughout the image. I'm going to have generally even coverage of the seafloor, despite having vehicle motion up to a certain point. The downfall of this is I precisely need to know where each sonar ping is for this to work. And generally it's on the order of 1/10 of a wavelength, which is quite a requirement that's needed to form these images. So this is just giving an example of a real aperture sonar image and a synthetic aperture sonar image. So this is the same data, just processed 2 different ways. So what we see in the side scan sonar image, we lose a lot of resolution in these kind of textured areas here. The shadows aren't as crisp in the real aperture sonar as they are in the synthetic aperture sonar. And if we blow this up a little bit and kind of look at individual tiles here, what we'll see is that on the bottom here, I show the synthetic aperture tiles. On the top, I'll show the real aperture. And you can see that you can really resolve fine scale structure. There's point scatterers in here that you can see very well. that really just aren't present in the real aperture. So all this is just motivating is the benefit of why care about using synthetic aperture sonar. and what are the advantages over kind of the conventional side scan sonars that folks use. Informing the picture that arrives from the sonar, that the sonar produces, we're going to get a time series for each ping, and this loosely describes the mathematical model for what that looks like. And just to kind of briefly walk through this, your transmitter is going to transmit some kind of FM chirp waveform. It's going to intersect at the bottom with some particular part of the seafloor that you want to image. That reflection is then going to come back to the receiver. I'm going to repeat this process for several different pings, and essentially you can think about the backscattering at this pixel sigma being this sigma here. And I'm going to do, the rest of this is just cranking through match filtering and geometry, but essentially for each ping, I'm going to end up with this time series. The point of this slide is that this ping here is generally it's complex basebanded data when it comes off of the A to D conversion. So what that's going to mean is that this is a complex value, which means that when I go to form my image, this is going to be a complex value. So instead of consumer imaging, where you think about your pixels just having real values, we're actually going to have values that are complex. So each pixel is going to be a complex valued entity, and that's going to come in later as we're going to exploit that as part of the contribution here. So SAS is used everywhere. I mean, really, folks just want to image the ocean floor. Around 2009, NOAA had estimated that we had only seen about 10% of the ocean floor. Folks are very interested in using SAS for habitat and environmental monitoring. So understanding coral reef structure, understanding as storm events go through areas, that significantly changes the seafloor bottom, and that can change what kind of critters and stuff go in those areas to feed. You'll want to look at human activity, so trawl marks as shipping and other vessels come through. Also safety and security. So the idea is I may have underwater communication infrastructure or pipelines, and I want to be able to examine those to make sure that folks haven't tampered with those. And also with faster graphics processing unit technology coming on board, we can now form these images in real time on the vehicle. So there's been quite a thrust towards intelligent survey. So meaning I can throw the vehicle overboard and kind of give it some loose objectives, and then it can sort of be like, okay, let me look around and see the area that I'm at, and then decide where to go from that. So a lot of this is automated processing. So there's a lot of the work here is kind of trying to bring all that automated processing up to a level that the humans can rely on it. So we can ship the vehicle off, it can go collect for a couple hours, come back. And we know that that imagery is useful. So there's some open challenges though with the automated processing of this data. The first is that deep learning. A lot of folks have used deep learning in the last decade. It's been really good for improving a lot of classification benchmarks. The downside of it is that it generally requires a lot of labeled data, like in terms of like millions of samples. And this is something for SAS it's difficult to collect this. Both I'll say, logistically, I have to coordinate chase boats, I have to coordinate divers to get ground truth. Politically, there might be areas I just can't get into very well. And then also, just coordinating getting ground truth in the image kind of space or on the seafloor versus, in a non-GPS environment versus trying to get, versus what I might see on the sea surface. So coordinating all that is difficult. Also, a lot of this deep network work has been centered around optical image data sets, but like for consumer imaging. However, a lot of that, the statistics of those images is much different than SAS images. So what I show here is I show horizontal and vertical features for an optical data set in blue, and then for the synthetic aperture data set in green and orange. And this is the horizontal, this is the vertical, and then the difference between the orange and the green is just whether I've done some kind of like image enhancement on it or not. But the point being is that these distributions are different. So it's not necessarily that I can take something that is from the optical domain and just apply it kind of in a black box method to the synthetic aperture data. And then finally, almost all the SAS machine learning methods throw away that complex part and just use the magnitude dynamic range compressed part of the image. So that magnitude vector coming from each pixel might have a dynamic range of 100 dB. On your display, like a display like this, you might only be able to display 30 dB. So some kind of exponential or log compression will be done for that data to be suitable for human consumption. So we're going to use this phase portion of the image for two of the contributions. And again, that's something that these optical data sets don't have to deal with because they don't have that data. So why domain enriched machine learning? So as I mentioned, the majority of these deep learning methods require explicit XY training pairs, which we don't always have, or it's difficult to come by in SAS, but we know from the physics of the problem that there's often structure still in that data that we can look at that's grounded in principles we understand of the acoustic phenomenology, of how the environment is set up. And what this thesis is trying to do is to integrate that structure into the deep network in a way that is useful, so we don't have to have a lot of abundant labeled data, but still work well. And there's two ways that I will do this. The first is that you can think about when I'm building my training objective, my optimization function for the training procedure, I can add regularization terms that capture that structure as part of the training procedure. So that's going to influence the representation that the network is going to learn. It's going to influence it in a way that's going to capture this kind of domain knowledge that encapsulates the data. And the other way that you can think about it is I can provide a custom network architecture which encourages the training procedure to utilize features that we know a priori from the physics to be discriminatory for the problem that you're working on. So kind of starting to put this all together into a larger picture, you can imagine the SAS image processing pipeline going from the time series that I collect from the sonar all the way to automated processing of the imagery as the following. So you can think about, you have data acquisition, which is going to be on board the underwater drone. That's going to give me time series and attitude measurements, so roll, pitch, and yaw, things like that of the vehicle. This next, it's going to go through an image reconstruction process. So this is going to result in our complex image, which we often call the single look complex image. This is a holdover from the radar folks. And then for reasons I'll get into, sometimes the image is a little bit blurry. So we'll run an autofocus algorithm on it. And then from there, we'll throw away that magnitude, or sorry, that phase portion again. We'll dynamic range compress this imagery. This is going to result in the dynamic range compressed image or human consumable image. So this, all the images I show where you see the ocean floor, that's at this stage. And then from there, we're going to go through an image enhancement, maybe to despeckle because there's speckle due to the SAS phenomenology. And then we're going to go through object recognition and seafloor segmentation. So the contributions that I'm going to make, contribution 1 is going to involve the image enhancement object recognition segment. Contribution 2 is going to involve seafloor segmentation. And I have this extra red line here. So generally, seafloor segmentation algorithms kind of peel off at this point. We're going to peel off from back here using that single look complex image. And then for the third contribution, it will involve this autofocus step. So for the first contribution, we're calling this the prior guided object recognition for synthetic aperture sonar. This resulted in 2 peer-reviewed papers. The first was a paper that appeared in Transactions in Geoscience and Remote Sensing. The second was a peer-reviewed conference paper that appeared in the International Geoscience and Remote Sensing Symposium. What motivates our approach for this is that we understand that images are noisy from speckle, they're noisy from low signal to noise ratio. Often a despeckler is used to kind of improve the image quality to the viewer, to the human viewer. The question that we're going to ask here is there an enhancement algorithm which improves classification? So instead of improving for human consumption, can we improve it in such a way for classification? Also, we know that we know some domain knowledge about how the object recognition algorithm works. And from a grand scheme point of view, how you can think about it is that most of the seafloor is benign. It's just a flat sandy bottom or maybe a very gentle ripple or something. So there's not really anything interesting there. So the idea is I don't want to go through and process all of that data because of the computational burden. So what I might do is just say, hey, I'm going to make a lightweight detection algorithm that's just going to go and find kind of salient areas. And then once those areas are found, then I'm going to run my automatic target recognition or my fancy classifier on it to then determine, is this object something I'm interested in? But what we've noticed is the majority of these detection algorithms, they do a very good job of centering the target when they discover it. So they're very good at localizing it. And the thought was, can we use this information during data augmentation while training to enhance the understanding that the deep network has of the image. And then also we wanted to look at specifically areas where we know that training data is limited. So what we'll do is we'll show an ablation study where we'll train our network with all the data that's been given to us, and then we'll train it with data with like 10% of the data that we have, and just show that we can get good performance, and that in fact integrating these two pieces of domain knowledge helps us even when we have flow training data. So the two priors that I'm going to talk about for this work, the first is the structural similarity prior. So the idea here is we want to learn image transform, which is going to improve classification. So the transform is going to take the image kind of from one space to another space, but we want this structure of that image to be maintained through that transformation. And we're going to define a cost function to preserve that. This is a self-supervised loss, so I don't have any ground truth. This is simply I'm making this transform. The transform is kind of, again, free to do as it wants, as long as it is able to meet this structural constraint. What's nice about this is I don't need any more ground truth data, so I can apply this type of processing to existing data sets and try to squeeze more data out of them. The structural scene context prior, as I mentioned, we know we augment the data set by these chip translations. We can use knowledge of where the target is now centered in the chip, and we'll have the network, instead of not only to estimate the image type, but also to estimate the position of the target in the image as well. So looking mathematically, what's the structure of the structural similarity prior? Our observed image, which we see has speckle in it, may have low SNR. It's going to come from some, ground truth oracle clean image, which we don't have access to. And there's going to be some function that, when combined with noise, is going to result in that observed image. What we know is that between the observed and the clean image, the noise doesn't completely destroy the structural content of the image. So that looking at something like a structural similarity metric, which is a psychovisual metric, that this number is going to be non-zero. So there's going to be some structure that is between the two images that we're going to want to preserve. So what we want to do here is we're actually going to model this in reverse. So we're going to say that we have, we're going to learn what this clean is, or we're going to call it enhanced, from these observations. What does this look like? So you can think about typical use cases for SSIM in the multi-scale version. I'm given some reference image, I have some corruption model with it, maybe it's data compression, maybe it's sending the data over a link or something. I get my observed image, and the idea is I want to be able to back calculate to this, and I also want to understand from a human point of view how corrupted these images are. So you can think about, if I plug in my reference image and my observed image, I'm going to get some value between 0 and 1. What I'm doing with the structural similarity prior is I'm kind of turning this on its head. What I'm given is the observed image, and what I want to do is calculate what this reference or enhanced image is, given the constraint that these two images are related like psychovisually because of the speckle. So thinking about the data augmentation for the second prior, typically what happens in training a deep network, a trick that folks play is they may say, well, I have some large chip, image chip that's going to come into the classifier, or could come into the classifier, but I know only a portion of that chip is actually useful or contains the target. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to I'll take a subset of that image, and it can be anywhere random within that larger chip. And what's going to happen is that's going to induce this translation. So here I show the center crop of the image of this particular cylindrical target here, and then I show the left crops and then the right crops. We're going to use this to augment our data, but what we also can do is this gives us then, as I pick a crop that's off of center, what that's going to induce is this shift here, this pixel shift both in X and in Y. So that's kind of given me an extra point of data. So instead of just looking at the chip and saying, is there a target in here or not, what I'm going to estimate is also where is that target centered at in that chip. So essentially, what translation did you apply to me during the data augmentation procedure? So how do we build this up into the network? So our network is the structural prior driven regularized deep learning network, or SPD RDL. How that starts is we're going to build up with a typical deep network structure where we have a feature extraction network or a backbone. In this case, it's a DenseNet 121 network, and that's going to be followed by a classification network. So this guy is just going to be predicting class out of here. So what kind of target do I have, or do I have a target or not? So you can look at, our loss function is going to be the difference between the ground truth prediction target and the ground truth target and the prediction target. So what I'm going to do then to add to that is I'm going to prepend this network with an enhancement network, which takes an image in and outputs an image. I'm going to constrain what this image can be by this multi-scale structural similarity index. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have this alpha parameter here, and I'm going to say, okay, the input image is going to come in, it's going to be enhanced through this network, and then it can only enhance in ways such that the structural content between these two is kept local. And then finally, what I'll do is I'll add a target localization network to this feature extraction backbone to also capture the relevant localized features as part of the learning process. So all I'm going to do here for this loss is just look at the difference between the mean squared error between the predicted shift and the ground truth shift, which I know from data augmentation. And then this only is going to apply to targets, because if I have objects in the scene, it's nonsensical because there's no objects in the scene. This will be a nonsensical loss. So we use W here as kind of an indicator vector to just say, hey, we're going to turn off this loss during training when we're seeing a background tile versus a target tile. So we're going to evaluate this algorithm on a NATO data set that we received from the muscle SAS system. Pretty much this data set is about 44,000 images. What we're going to do to split this data up into training, validation, and test, we're going to divide this data up into two segments based on time. So for the first kind of 6 years of this 10-year collection period, we're going to use this data for training and validation, and then we're going to use this training and data set B here for test. We're going to compare on several existing methods, including 3 deep learning methods, of which one of those includes the backbone that we use for our feature extraction network. We're also going to train on 2 shallow learning methods, a dictionary method and a bag of words method both of these have been used specifically for SAS. The objects, the classification, the categories for the objects, we're going to have 4 of them. So we're going to have background, cylinder shape, a cone shape, and a wedge shape. We're also going to then categorize the classes a little different, where we're going to group these 3. So essentially we'll end up with a binary classifier of target and background, and we're going to measure area under the precision recall curve for those as well. So let's take a look at some of the results here. So looking at the confusion matrices for the first 3 methods here, what we can see is we want the measure of goodness is high numbers along this diagonal here. What we can see is that for most of the classes, the method that we propose does the best compared to these 2 other deep learning methods. When we look at the rest of the methods, we see the same thing. We see even better relative performance with the method that we've come up with versus these existing methods. Then we can take a look at the precision recall curve. So this again is dividing this problem into a target background problem. And what we can see here is that good results are when these curves tend to this upper right-hand corner here. And then I can also summarize that statistic by just taking the area under this curve. And what we can see here, I have the areas listed for these comparison methods. And what we see is that the method that we propose does the best out of all existing methods. I then can look at this as a function of range. So I can imagine that I can take all of my image chips and I can calculate where in range they occurred in the sonar beam. What I would expect is that objects far out of range are going to have low signal to noise ratio just simply because of spreading and absorption loss in the water column. Objects in close may have low SNR because I'm not directly in the beam or I'm in a side lobe of the transmit receive pattern. And what I can see here is that as I bin up my range, and I calculate AUCPR as a function of range, what I see is that in the sweet spot of the beam, the algorithm that we propose does the best, and then that we get the best benefit when we're in close to the sonar and also when we're far away from the sonar. So then we can look at training selection bias where we have limited training. So you can imagine if I have all the data, this is just a repeat of results from the previous precision recall curve slides. If I train with just 10% of that data, you can see that many of the methods do not have a very graceful degradation in performance. We show that ours does. The other thing that we do is that the random 10% that we take, we run 10 trials of that. So we're taking different selections of that data and we're running the training procedure and then classifying on the test set. And we just show down here what the distribution of those scores are. And you can see further to the right you are, the better results you have. And what you can see is that the method we propose gives us the best results and has the lowest variance compared to the other two. So this just shows some non-reliance on what this selection bias is. So we're not sensitive to the specific, as sensitive to the specific data points used in training these algorithms. Okay, for the second contribution, this is deep what we call deep. Yes.
You can pause and invite any questions at this stage. Does
anybody have any questions?
What's the class imbalance on that first data set?
The class imbalance on this data set, I think, is somewhere around 10 to 1. I have it somewhere, but I believe roughly that's what it is. Yeah, it's in the dissertation. Yes.
Would you say the reason it's more robust to limited data, that like amount of limited data, is due to the fact that it took into account the physical structure of the data that others might not have taken?
Yeah, so the thought is that those two prior, so there's an ablation study that I show, which I have buried somewhere in the backup slides, but essentially we've gone through and said, okay, what if we turn off the other two terms? Find this here real quick for that loss function. If I turn off these terms, I get some performance. As I turn these terms on, the performance starts to go up. And the other thing that we've done is we got a question about, why not just use a fixed despecular here, other than, you can argue, well, you have, this despecular image enhancement is data adaptive. It can do things other than despeckle. So what if we just put in here something like a median filter or a Gaussian filter or mean filter? We also show those results in the thesis, and we find that when this enhancement network was in, it beats all the other configurations.
When you look at the enhanced images, do you like the way they look better than a despeckled image?
They look very similar. What I've noticed is that the despeckle is definitely anisotropic. So it's doing something that's not just simply applying like a Gaussian filter to it. I personally like the despeckled images just a little bit more from my point of view. But again, when we've run them through the classifier, I find that I don't get as good results as when I use this adaptive method. And some of that could be related to the biases that are built into the neural network in terms of what it thinks is interesting, in terms of how it's creating that representation space. Any other questions?
Could you go to the confusion matrix?
Sure.
It seems. Slide is okay. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Was that Dan Brown who asked the question about how do the despeckled images, the image adaptive ones, or sorry, the data adaptive ones versus the fixed ones look?
Yeah, that was Dan Brown.
Yeah, the voice on. So you can share with Dan. I think we have some frequency domain analysis of those images also, right? It may not be in the slides, but I think we definitely did it, and we had some plots in your paper.
That's right. Yeah, I'll
so you can share with him either your thesis copy or those for those things.
I think it is, but it's a good result to say, like, the reason I asked the question is I think it's interesting, like, the change that happened is a change that you think makes sense. Right, like
in fact,
thing that you think it should do, which to me is a really interesting.
I think Isaac was pointing this out. He may not have said it in these words, while mildly rephrased. One element of surprise was that I think Isaac said something to the effect that I personally like the sort of the standard despeckled images more just from a visual consumption standpoint, right?
Right.
But one remarkable thing was that the sort of the adaptively enhanced ones were better from a classification accuracy standpoint, even though visually sort of the standard despeckling seemed more So that was actually very interesting.
Any other questions? Okay, I'll move on to the next contribution. So this is an image segmentation problem. We're calling this contribution, calling it the deep multi-look sequence processing for synthetic aperture sonar image segmentation. There were 2 papers produced from this work. We have a provisional acceptance in IEEE transactions on geoscience and remote sensing, which went through earlier this month. And then we also have a peer-reviewed conference paper that was in the International Geoscience and Remote Sensing Symposium. So segmentation is an interesting problem for SAS in the respect that it's very difficult to get labeled data for this, because to send a team of divers down and kind of map every point out in a particular instance of time, and then coordinate that back to actual georeference pixel labels is just difficult for a number of reasons. The data set that we were given kind of has this compromise to it where the data set was collected by the Navy, and they told the human operators, hey, just label the easy parts. So they went through and they said, yeah, I pretty much know that these are going to be dark sand. This is going to be a ripple field. And again, they didn't label exactly up to the borders. It was just kind of like, hey, circle a part that is going to look ripply, and a part that is going to look like rock. So we call this a partial or weakly labeled data set. So again, we don't have classification. We don't have ground truth for these pixels in the black area here. So if you look at these, we look over 7 different classes for the segmenter to evaluate. We have an acoustic shadow and dark sand class, light sand, seagrass, a rock, and we also have a small and large ripple class. Some of these classes have acoustic scattering mechanisms which are aspect independent. You can think about the shadow class. As I look at objects on the seafloor, the texture on the seafloor, from ping to ping, what I notice is as I'm moving past it, one way or the other, that shadow behind it is going to change. And you can think about this is just similar if you have objects on your floor at home and you take a flashlight and you kind of move the flashlight around them, your shadow is going to move. So it'd be nice to be able to take advantage of that kind of processing, or at least that physics as part of this problem. So yeah, there's a lot of aspect angle dependent scattering mechanisms going on. Is it possible that we can utilize that information as part of this segmentation procedure? And the answer is yes. So you can think about each individual ping has its own real aperture array that it's generating the data from, the time series from. What I can do is I can squint this beam or narrow it and then steer it around. So I'm exchanging azimuthal resolution for directionality. And what I'm able to do is, sometimes they call this squint processing, or they'll call this multi-look processing if I generate several different images from those squints. And what we can do is we can do this from the input single look complex image. So how is this done? So if I'm given my single look complex image, so again, complex pixels. If I take the Fourier transform of that, I go into Kx and Ky space. If I do an interpolation on that space, what I end up in is frequency, which is related to the sonar center frequency, and then I end up with the look angle dimension. So you can think about if I want to just steer the beam and look at just a certain subset of the image, as if it was just generated with that part of that direction of the beam, I would just filter out over frequency like a rectangular chunk like this. Yeah, and I'll say that this interpolation can't always be done, because many times when sonar operators or producers will give you the data, they don't give you the center frequency of the sonar because it's proprietary. But however, you can use an approximation if you know your center frequency to bandwidth ratio is high enough, which in this case it is just based on the geometric scattering we see. There's an approximation you can use to essentially equate that these two spaces are the same. And what does that look like? What I show here is that the colored isolines are showing what the true in this direction. This is showing the true frequency. And then in this direction, I'm showing what the slices of constant angle of arrival are. And then I'm overlaying on top of that just a fixed rectangular Cartesian grid of what they are if I don't use the approximation. And what we see is that for the approximation for the angular error, I'm off by no more than a degree, and that's suitable for what we're doing for this processing that we're about to do. So what does this processing look like in practice? This is going to help motivate the network that I designed here. So what I show here is I show a set of single look complex images which are filtered by this process. The corresponding k-space filter is below here. So what you can see is I'm walking this filter essentially across the angle band. So I'm sweeping the beam across and I'm generating the resultant image that filtering gives you. And then I'm putting for reference over here at the right, the non-filtered image or the static image. So this is all white because this filter is all ones. And what I want to draw your attention to is this upper right-hand corner here. If I look at the no filtered image, I see that there's like a fuzz up here and I'm not sure what that fuzz is. However, when I apply the processing and I apply it in this way, what I see is that this fuzz kind of moves. And in fact, this is likely biologics or a fish cloud in the water column. So as the synthetic aperture is moving and collecting data and processing it, these biologics are moving in the water column. So now I'm able to discern two things. One, if there's motion during the synthetic aperture sonar collection, which might obscure the seafloor, I can now kind of tease that apart a little bit. And two, any kind of like acoustic shadow, acoustic shadowing that might occur, I'm able to really see where those kind of dependencies show up in the data because I'm able to highlight them through this process. So it'd be really nice if, let me back up for 1 second. It'd be really nice if I don't have to specify what these filters look like in terms of the shape and the bandwidth and also where they're located at. And it's kind of like, I'll say a black art where folks who in the sonar community kind of heuristically pick what these are if they want to generate a sequence like this for a presentation. So the thought that I had was it'd be really nice if I could just let the network decide what those should look like. So what I do is I start with the old handy rectangular filter, which for signal processing reasons, we don't want to use that because we end up with Gibbs phenomenon and a bunch of other really kind of nasty issues we don't want. But can we get a differentiable version of this? And the answer is yes. We can use this nice limit here of definition of the rectangle function. So what I can do here is when I send n off to infinity, I'm getting the full rectangle function. As I'm backing that number, that n, especially closer, like say 0 to 10, I'm getting a smooth version of that, or what we call the soft rectangular version. And this really affords me two things. One is I can control the Gibbs artifacts that I get from that filtering process. And two, this function is fully differentiable. So this can be part of a deep learning training process through stochastic gradient descent. So here, what I've done is I just picked 10, seems like a reasonable trade-off for the filter response. And now what I can do is I can characterize the filter by its offset, by the bandwidth and the attenuation to make all these parameters learnable as the training process goes. So putting this all together into a segmentation network, from the highest level view, we're starting with our single look complex image. So this is real and imaginary. And we're going to be outputting a segmentation map where each pixel corresponds to a vector of probabilities of what the probability of a particular class is. When this input image is put into the network, it's going to immediately go off to two paths. I'll talk about the easy path first. This is the static image path. So this is kind of a holdover from the previous ways that images have been handled. All we're going to do with this image is just, we're not going to do any kind of k-space filtering to it. We're just going to dynamic range compress it. And then we're just going to send it through a UNet to generate some features. So this is kind of taking the traditional way that it's been done, or where the whole image is used and there's no filtering in k-space, and we're going to generate features from that. The other path, which is the interesting path, is the multi-look sequence path. So for this, we're going to take the Fourier transform, because again, this is also differentiable. We're going to take the Fourier transform of the input data. That's going to put us into k-space, and then we're going to have 8 filter modules here, which we're going to initialize to essentially just kind of walk the filter response across the band. And then each one of those filter paths is going to be inverse FFT. We're going to dynamic range compress it and then send that through a shared UNet to then generate the features for each of these frames. And then each of those frames are going to be reweighted by a squeeze and excitation network. So now what I've done is I've taken an image that is generally thought of as static, like it's fixed. I've converted it into a sequence of images that have temporal information in them now. And what I'm going to do to exploit that temporal information is I'm going to pass that image sequence into a recurrent neural network, this 2D convolutional LSTM. And what that's going to do then, those features from the static path and also from the temporal path, I'm going to merge those features together. I'm going to pass them through a final segmentation net to end up with the final segmentation path. So I'm going to train this on a data set of just 113 images. That's all that was given to us. It really wasn't a lot of data at all. The data is very class imbalanced. So you can see here that, you know, even between training and test, I have a lot of class imbalance just with the number of samples I have. Also in between classes, I have quite a different, I have a big class imbalance. And then also you can just see there's a lot of unlabeled pixels that are in the training set. So how do we train on this? We use the focal loss. And again, pixel for pixel, we just want to minimize the error between the ground truth pixel and the predicted pixel category. And we're also going to play the same trick we did last time, where we're just going to weight this loss with this indicator vector here, W. So where we have a pixel and this loss is valid, we're going to set that to 1. Where we don't have a pixel, this is just going to be set to 0. And if we take a look at results over a bunch of comparison methods, looking at the mean pixel accuracy, and then also looking at the accuracy for each individual class from acoustic shadow, dark and light sand, seagrass, rock, small and large ripple. What we see is that if we take the average of these to get the mean pixel average, the proposed method does the best. We also do an ablation study where we say, hey, let's turn off that filtering path, because maybe it's just the fact that there's something going on through the case-based domain, but it's not necessarily related to improving the performance. So what we do is we just essentially set all the filters to 1. So there's no temporal information. That's going to be this MLSP net no filter. And we can see that we get a better mean pixel average overall by adding the domain knowledge in from the multi-look sequence processing than without it. The other interesting thing that we see is for some of these classes like acoustic shadow, we do much better than some of the next best methods in classifying them by a pretty good margin. So I can do the same kind of sensitivity analysis that I did in the last work, and that was to examine multiple trials of the training data. So I've trained both of these networks. These were the top 2 networks with the best MPA. I've trained them 10 times, and I've just plotted what the resulting MPA is on the test set. And what we can see is that both the mean and the median are larger than without that filter. Again, just motivating the idea that adding the domain knowledge in helps and improves our performance. And then finally, I can take a look at the filter modules as they evolve over the training process. So here I'm just showing the position. So I'm initializing them just uniformly across the band. So there's 8 of these guys here. I can look at the bandwidths of each of them, and I can look at the attenuations. And what we see for the positions that these guys do move around a little bit. What's interesting that we see for the bandwidths is that this guy in red is this filter here, is that he opens up a bit in bandwidth, and some of these other guys just start to squint a little bit more. So there is some adaptivity that's going on as part of the training procedure to utilize those features and then be able to improve the classification result. And then qualitatively looking at this, what I show here is just 4 sample input images, what their human provided labels look like, and then the top 3 methods with the best MPA, what their results are, what the differences are between their result and the ground truth. So that's shown in the error shown in white. And then I show that for this method, and then for our method with no filter, and then for the method, our method here with every kind of all the bells and whistles. And you can see that we have the least amount of error out of all of these. And then also there's this red guy, this red label here is an acoustic shadow. And you can see that our method was one of the only methods that was really able to pick that up well. And it got a little bit confused with dark sand, which is the blue. But you can see that at least for some of this data, it was able to disambiguate those 2 classes. If you look at the confusion matrices, you see much better improvement overall between those 2 classes using the MLSP net. So again, that wraps up that contribution. I'll take any questions.
I was gonna ask, just looking at the system of the net, there's all these different parts and shared weights. Was that tough to get it to train well? Like, did you have to search for those hyperparameters for a while, or?
This I did not. What I found that worked the best was, what gave the best results was just kind of modeling off of existing methods that were done, like kind of what were the heuristics that they used, right? Making this shared or not shared. But what I noticed what helped was that just looking at the outputs, the features of these and the statistics of these, that you could kind of see that there was a lot of variance. And I thought, well, it might just be useful to put on some kind of squeeze and excitation to balance that out, because, you know, there's a different amount of energy going into each one of these, of acoustic energy going into each one of these filters as I sweep across the band, just because of how the system is set up. And this has to do with what actually is organized in K-space and what's not. So there's you know, the same amount of acoustic energy. The beam is not uniformly sensing, you know, from one side of the aperture to the other. So I thought adding this in will at least help balance that, and I found that worked out really well.
Thanks.
The hardest part, I think, was just the training, because I'm doing 8 Fourier transforms and then inverse Fourier transforming, which just gives me the libraries that are doing this don't do nice batching and stuff yet to be able to speed that up. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question about, you showed the graph, the changing bandwidth with respect to f-ups, right?
Was it this one?
No, it's like each position.
Oh. This one.
Yes.
Mhm.
This one, so mean bandwidth is bandwidth of the filter in terms of angle.
Correct. So this is angular. You can think about this angular bandwidth. So if my aperture, you think about it as it's convex, right? I have this cone shaped. This is essentially how far am I opening up that cone.
So is catching, maybe the filter needs to be different depending on what class it is, what ground class it is.
It could. So you could make it adaptive. There's a way to do that also. This is just simply taking them as fixed, saying, given the data I have, what is sort of the best kind of squints to look at to separate these classes out. But you could certainly, there's a version of this in IGARS which has a data adaptive viewpoint in it, where yes, these filters, it'll look at the data, then decide, okay, I'm going to decide the filters that way. This way, it's just fixed. It's looking over all the data. They're still learning and adaptive, but it's the same filter applied to all the data.
Very good.
Yes,
And so in this one, it looks like the
Boresight filter.
is the one that's widest.
Yep, and it widened up as it went. And then some of the other ones just shrunk a little bit and kind of moved around. But in general, it was interesting to see that this Boresight filter opened up a bit, especially since we know when that filter's opened up the whole way, the result is not as good as when it's not. So that was kind of an interesting find. Yes.
Did you ever have any problems with your positions like collapsing? Or do you have some weight that is trying to keep them apart from each other?
I didn't. So I thought that might happen, and I never had that problem. And I attribute that purely to the data. I think that in reality, yes, you could have that, and you could put an extra penalty term in to maybe look at an affinity matrix or something of this and just say, hey, I don't want this affinity matrix to line up in a certain way or have certain structure so that these guys are partitioned out, right? It's hard with this because there's 100 samples, right? So like, it's one of these things that my sort of intuition is as the amount of data grows, even if I had 10,000 samples, which still isn't a lot, that I think this effect would get bigger. Any other questions? Okay. Well, great. You guys all survived with me so far. That's great. This is the last contribution. This contribution is prior guided image enhancement for SAS. This resulted in a conference paper, or sorry, a journal paper for transactions on geoscience and remote sensing that is essentially done. We're just putting the finishing touches on that for submission. And then also a peer-reviewed conference paper in the International Geoscience and Remote Sensing Symposium, which took 3rd place in the student paper competition. And then we also were encouraged by the department to file a patent. So we have a provisional patent through the process right now on this work. So this work concerns the idea that I have some defocused image that comes out of my image reconstruction algorithm, and I want that image to be well focused. And where this defocusing can affect things is I can think about if I'm an oceanographer, I'm interested in things like point scatterers. And I can see that my point scatterer blurs quite a bit in the defocused image. If I'm interested in textures, that I'm losing contrast in these textures as the image defocuses. So the question you may think is, well, why does this become defocused? So recall from this original diagram way back at the beginning of the talk that for me to form a good image, I have to know the time of flight well from the transmitter to where I want an image on the ocean floor and then back to the receiver. If at any point I don't know the time of flight of that well, which for example may come up if I don't know the speed of water or the speed of sound in the water column, or I have heterogeneous speed of sound in the water column. So maybe I'm in the ocean, I'm coming up to a river estuary, I have brackish water mixing with fresh water and the sound speed's changing. So I don't know this, so that's going to affect that time of flight. If I don't know where these positions are at, remember to form the synthetic aperture, I have to know the position of the sonar ping to ping about 1/10 of a wavelength. If I don't know that, that's also going to result in this image degradation process happening. So what's interesting about this process, you can think about this process kind of manifesting itself in two ways from an engineering point of view. The first is that, hey, the motion estimation and the understanding where the vehicle position was and understanding the water column, I don't know anything about it at all, right? So I'm going to end up with some kind of random phase error. In that case, my point spread function just simply broadens, the signal to noise ratio lowers, and I lose a lot of just detail in general of the ocean floor. But the other kind of interesting class, which is seen, I would say more in practice, is this idea of having systemic error. So I might not estimate correctly, like the speed of sound in the water column, as I mentioned. I might have an uncompensated yaw to my vehicle, which is going to result in a sawtooth phase error. Or perhaps as my vehicle is serpentining through the water due to currents, I'm not quite estimating that right, and I end up with a sinusoidal error. What's interesting about all that is the work from Cook and Brown, he's the et al. Here, is that they came up with this really interesting kind of eye chart, I call it, in their paper back in 2008, where they said, hey, this systemic phase error that we see, it manifests itself by giving structure to the image in a way that maybe you don't want, right? So you can think about like, these are going to result in blur in the along track direction. For some of these phase error types, what you're going to see is you're going to get these kind of lobes coming off the main point spread functions, and you get these repeated patterns. And where this can become detrimental is especially if you're looking at an ocean floor bottom that maybe you haven't seen before, and you see something like this, is you're not sure, is this a problem with my motion estimation, or is this actual what this object looks like? And some seafloors can be very confusing for this. But we were inspired by the fact that, they realized that a human can look at these images and say, oh, I know that this error comes from this particular source. I know where in my image reconstruction algorithm I should look. So a human can definitely classify what types of error that are and say something, I'll say qualitatively, about how bad this error is. So the question that I asked was, well, that seems like a good computer vision problem to automate. The problem with that, though, is that there's also an ambiguity associated with all of these, in that whatever the phase error is, say it's quadratic, I can also have the negative of that, right? So I have this sign flip problem. So I have this weird symmetry that I have to back out. I need the phase information from the single look complex to back that information out. The problem is, if you've ever looked at the phase map of these, is that they're extremely noisy. All that's really to say is that it's a very discontinuous function. And so originally I thought, that's going to be game over. But this interesting paper came out from Jonas Adler and Andrea Hoffman, where they showed that even when you have really discontinuous imagery, what they found was that CNNs can often still learn useful features. So this motivated me to continue down this path of trying to do this. And I'll show some good results from this. We compare or look at kind of the traditional methods that have been used to fix this problem, which are mostly metric-based methods. So those methods are saying, I have some contrast metric or a image sharpness metric, and I want to maximize or minimize it, depending on the context. And these functions are usually kind of hand designed. And our thought is well, let's just use the convolutional neural network to design that function for us. So just looking at the mathematical mechanics of how this works and how k-space and phases involved, you can imagine I have this defocused image here, G sub little e, and it's corrupted by a known phase aperture, in this case phi, or phi hat. If I take the 2D Fourier transform of this image, I'm going to get a magnitude in a phase plane. What I can do is take my correction, I can add that to the phase plane. And then so now I have a new phase plane associated with the same frequency magnitude map. And then I can take the inverse FFT of that. I'm going to end up with my good autofocused, well-focused image. And that's going to be, this process is described by this equation here in 9. What I can think about in terms of turning this into an optimization problem is that I have some metric M that I'm trying to optimize for. And what I can do is I don't know this yet. I don't know what phi hat is, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to, hypothesize a phi hat. I'm going to measure the contrast and look at the gradient of that error. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue along that gradient until I minimize or maximize that objective. So this is kind of the traditional way of doing it. Looks like from just the mechanical, the mathematical mechanics of it. One of the interesting things about these metric-based methods is that they only operate on a single image at a time. So every image that's processed is done independently. Maybe the most exotic thing that is done is you'll have a fancy optimizer that's kind of wrapped around your metric to make sure that it converges. The other thing that you'll see is that you'll bootstrap kind of image 2 with whatever your result was of image 1. But in general, these are all iterative. These are kind of 4 metrics that are common for folks to use. These have been used in astronomy, synthetic aperture radar. This one from Steve Fortune was developed specifically for SAS. And there were folks, people throw in the entropy kind of measures at this, which are pretty typical in signal and image processing for these metrics. But the point is, all these metrics are differentiable. So I can use them nicely in both, a gradient descent and a stochastic gradient descent process if I need to. So again, I just want to pull up this equation again, just showing how the traditional metric-based methods work. What often you find with these methods in practice is you have a lot of convergence problems. You don't know what the learning rate should be or your gradient step size should be. You'll find that you'll get images which really don't fit the contrast model or sharpness model that you have. So what's done is kind of these designer weighting functions or kind of heuristic ad hoc weighting functions are provided to the input data to say, hey, listen, this area looks too fuzzy. I'm gonna kind of bleed it out. I don't want to look at it. In other areas that maybe have something which I might think is a point scatter, which would be something nice to focus on. I'm going to kind of boost those areas up. So to improve convergence, folks add this weighting function here. So putting this all together for our proposed method, which we call deep autofocus, is instead of handcrafting what the metrics are and what the features are, so that's kind of all wrapped up in that W function, we're going to implicitly learn that from a set of training data. Both that involve the dynamic range compressed image, and we're also going to look at that phase map again for the single look complex image. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to reformulate this problem. So we're going to take it from an iterative problem to just a problem that we can solve in a single fast forward pass through the network. So that gets rid of that the computational burden. So putting this together into a tangible deep learning network, we're going to have our input image in. So this is going to be, sorry, let me back up. We're going to have some kind of ground truth image, which we're going to corrupt through a defocus model, which we know based on the physics of the problem at hand, which types of defocusing that we're often going to get and how strong those are going to be. That's going to result in this input image here to the network. We're going to convert that image to the dynamic range compressed version and a phase version. We're going to extract features from those networks using a pre-trained dense net. And then out of this, that feature vector is going to go into a regression network. So we have a semi-parametric model here for estimating the phase error. So we're going to divide it into components of the sinusoid, polynomial, and then a non-parametric portion. And then we're going to sum those outputs together. We're going to remove the mean of that resulting phase error and detrend it because those things don't affect, those things just simply translate the image around or shift the phase, but they don't actually change the image content. So that leaves us with our estimated phase error. We're then going to take this input image, FFT that, again, differentiable, and then apply this correction in k-space, inverse FFT, dynamic range compress, and hopefully end up back at our autofocused image. There's going to be 2 flavors of this work that we have proposed. The first was a supervised approach where, we know what this ground truth image is here. So what we can do is we can use something like a structural similarity matrix to try to minimize the distance between the ground truth and then our predicted ground truth image. The other way we thought was it'd be very interesting just to use this in a self-supervised method. I just pick one of the metrics, and all I'm saying for the loss function is that, say it's contrast, I'm just saying, I just want the contrast at the end here to be larger than the contrast at the start. That's it. So that removes this input going into it. When I train all of this, this is going to be back propagated all the way back through the model. The errors are back to the beginning. So that's a lot of training that has to be done. But when I deploy this out to the vehicle in situ, all I have to execute is this forward pass here in red. So all of my training and computational burden is shifted off to the training portion of this network. And then during inference, I get a very fast function that I can use to estimate this phase. So just to show kind of like what did our data augmentation look like and what did our model look like for the phase, this is just 10 random polls of that model. So this model involves sinusoidal, sawtooth, and polynomial phase errors. And you can just, in combinations thereof of them, so you can see there's some sinusoid with some sawtooth, there's some polynomial in here, but we really wanted to throw kind of the kitchen sink at it to see how well it could do. So these corruptions are pretty severe. And then to benchmark this against existing methods, we compared against those 4 metrics that I previously showed, plus another method called phase gradient autofocus, which is a common technique used in synthetic aperture radar that folks use. All this slide is really to say is that we don't have much training or tests, and we're still able to get good results with the deep network. The other thing down here in the comparison methods point of view is that we have to select things like the step size for the comparison methods. We essentially overfitted them to the test set. We said, what is the absolute best I can do with those comparison methods on the test set, so they are showing the absolute best light as possible. So we ran this gigantic cross validation to find that out, and that will be the results that I showed here. So we looked at all the methods. So let's just go through this real quick. So here's no autofocus. So this is what the images look like just coming out of the data augmenter. Here's the supervised and self-supervised methods for our deep autofocus method. Here are the 4 metrics, and then we also have a weighted version of them. So there was in finance paper, he proposed a weighting function that people often use. So we said, let's throw that in as well. It does a little bit better than kind of the standard methods. But we evaluated peak signal to noise ratio, which is kind of a traditional image quality metric, structural similarity and multi-scale structural similarity metrics, which these are psychovisual metrics. What we can see is that everything to the right means better. So we can see for the self-supervised, for deep autofocus methods, for all of these methods that we do considerably better than these methods trained for 10 iterations. So again, we're only doing 1 iteration. We've let these guys train for 10. And we get much better results. One thing that you often see in practice with autofocus, it will make images worse. This is not an uncommon thing. So I said, let's just look at the change in focus quality. So what you can see, same metrics again, just looking at the delta change in the metric. So 0, you want to stay to the right of 0 if you've always improved. Anything to the left of 0 means you've got worse. So you can see that for all these metrics, there are some images in which the autofocus performance actually does worse than to start, and then also that the deep autofocus methods we don't experience that kind of error. So I'll show some qualitative results. So here's an original well-focused image. I'm just showing the 3 different types that I can tease them out. So quadratic, sinusoidal, and sawtooth. These are the autofocused versions of those. I'm also going to show because I estimate the phase error, I get kind of a little bit of explainability out of the network. So here I show the defocused image, the result from deep autofocus, the ground truth, just differencing these 2 images for this part, just so you can kind of draw your eye to where things are different. You can see it's really limited to the speckle field, which is that's an okay thing. And then I show here the differences in the ground truth phase error and the estimated phase error. You can see that they lie on top of each other very well. And then we also looked at real data. So this is not involved in the training, validation, or test. This is just data that has gone through a standard beamformer. It has some residual phase error in it. We thought, let's just run it on that and see what we get. I show 2 images. I pick out point scatterers in 2 of these images, and I show the zooms here. So these are the original images. These are the images through deep autofocus. I then take a vertical slice through each of these point scatterers here. And what I show is that the blue is the original slice, and the orange is the deep autofocus slice. And what you can see is that the point spread function really buttoned up on both of those quite well. And then finally, I get the estimated phase error that it thinks that that was generated to defocus the image. And I can see here that I get an image that looks like I have quadratic phase error. And here it looks like I have quadratic phase error coupled with yaw error, which seems pretty reasonable given the magnitude and the geometry of this function that these are like true. And then with that, I'll just summarize kind of this research again. So again, if I go back to this diagram from collection of data from the UUV and the time series, all the way through forming the image, going from the complex image to the magnitude image, and then finally to the automated processing of target recognition and segmentation. We've used domain enrichment throughout this process to kind of take knowledge that we understand about the problem and the structure of the problem, but maybe isn't necessarily represented as XY training pairs. We're able to put that into the neural network to get us good results that don't require us to have an abundant amount of training data. And I'd like to thank the Naval Research Office, or ONR, for funding the majority of this work. The NATO Center for Maritime Research and Experimentation provided us the data for contribution 1. The Naval Surface Warfare Center in Panama City provided us the data for contributions 2 and 3. And Penn State ARL partially funded some of the writing of this work. And then in total, working with myself and my advisor and my colleagues at the lab, these are the publications that have resulted from this work. And with that, I'd like to thank Dr. Monga for his time and for his guidance, the committee for your time and supervision. And I'd like to thank my wife who helped support me along the way, because I quite honestly couldn't have done this without her. And then, yeah, there's lots of folks to thank. I thank you guys for coming to this. I appreciate it greatly. This is definitely a team effort in terms of getting to this point, and I really appreciate it. And with that, I will open it up for questions.